Please be seated. Sometimes I cringe when something bad or tragic or hurtful happens and someone says it is God's will or God has a plan or purpose for it. I wonder if the person saying that thinks about what that assertion suggests about God, especially the God we say is love. This view of God has bothered me so much that I wrote a book on it. I wrote a book on the subject of how we image God and God's actions. The book presents and examines 7 different ways to understand who God is and how God acts. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all 7. Part of what inspired me to write that book was how easily and frequently my theology students talked about God's will. Another inspiration at the time came from an article in the newspaper that reported on a tragic accident. 2 teenage girls equally accomplished went horseback riding when one of the horses reared back, threw off its rider, and then fell on top of her. She died. The other girl was unhurt. In the newspaper article about this, the godmother and aunt of the girls is quoted as saying, "God must have needed another angel. That's why he took our Kayla." While the mother is reported as saying, "It was just a freak accident. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It just happened." These 2 women who both loved the girl offered very different understandings of the same event. One connected the event to God's will and saw a purpose in it. The mother did not. I mention this story because today's readings from Isaiah and from the Gospel of Matthew also present 2 different and contrasting views of God's intents and actions. The prophet Isaiah, speaking to Israel in exile, is reminding the people of Israel that God's purpose will be realized and will offer flourishing and abundance. Quote, "As the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return there until they have watered the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose and succeed in the thing for which I sent it." For a people in exile who felt that their God was distant or maybe even that God had abandoned them, these words would have been cherished words of assurance. For people who felt powerless in captivity, these words might well have given them hope of return and a fruitful future. The words assure the hearers that God is in charge. God's actions are directed towards certain ends, and God's purposes will be realized. There will be abundance and rejoicing and restoration. Even if those in exile cannot see it, they can trust in God's will to restore them. The God of the parable of the sower acts differently. If the God of Isaiah's actions are directional, going out and returning to fulfill its purpose, the sower God's actions seem more random, casting out seed without paying much attention, it seems, to where the seed might land. Whether the seed will find fertile soil or hard rock, whether it will be able to survive the conditions it finds itself in or not. We might even see such actions as wasteful. Who plants that way, just tossing seeds about? When I lived in Barrington, Rhode Island on the bay, there were a series of homes along the beach. Each had an ample lawn going down to the beach wall. These were all very well-tended and mown lawns, except for one. Its lawn was full of wildflowers of many kinds and colors, as if someone threw seed about randomly. It was beautiful and purposeful in its way, but also very unorderly. Similarly, with the sower God, whose actions are not very directed, this is the case. In fact, the sower is scattering seed more than planting it. Who can predict the results of such a scattershot approach to sowing? So in Matthew, God seems to act differently. While God's intent to foster life abundant remains clear, though there will be seeds that will bear fruit, there's no guarantee of that. No promise of God making sure of the outcome. In fact, God is not directing the action so much as offering the conditions for life to happen. God is not executing a plan so much as starting a process. Why might Matthew view God's actions differently? Matthew's context is quite different from that of Isaiah. The people of Israel, although occupied and oppressed by the Roman Empire, are not in exile. They are home. The temple is intact and they have access to it. So Jesus is speaking in a different context and with a different purpose. Jesus' purpose in preaching is to proclaim and enact the kingdom of God, God's shalom. The parables are meant to teach us about the kingdom. A little later in Matthew, as we will hear in a couple of weeks, Jesus offers a series of images. The kingdom of God is like this, the kingdom of God is like that. When Jesus preached and taught, healed and acted, it was for the sake of God's coming reign, the kingdom of God. This was the heart of his message in word and in deed. This was his purpose, his intent, his mission. But Jesus was not a commander, the one in charge, so to speak. Rather, Jesus did what he did as an offering, not a command. His intent is invitational and inspirational and evocative. Let any with ears listen. If you are able to hear and respond to God's call, come, follow me, he says. The seeds are Jesus' preaching and teaching and action, signs of his mission. We are the soil or terrain, if you will, the receivers. Not all will receive them similarly or respond in the same way. Some of the seeds may come to more fruition than others. Some may not sprout at all. Even though there is cause and effect in Jesus' description of what happens to the seeds, there is unpredictability as well. The outcome is not necessarily determined or known. What then do these different views of God's actions and God's will mean for us? One thing it means is that there's no one way to understand how God acts in the world and in our lives. Another thing, and more importantly, it means that the context we live in, the position we occupy in the world, the power we do or do not have, and how we use the power we have, all those things need to be considered whenever we talk about God's will or claim something to be of God. I think this is particularly important today because of all the claims being made by Christian nationalists and others about who God is and how God acts. In the name of God's will, they're exercising their own power and desire for control. Both these implications, both understanding that there's no singular way to imagine God's actions and being attentive to the power dynamics and intents and play when claims are made about God, are related, since plurality is a guard against hegemony. I'm going to say that again. Plurality is a guard against hegemony. Now, that may be an odd note on which to end a sermon, but in today's world, if we are to heed and follow God, our faith must include thinking critically and carefully as we seek to discern the presence and intent of God. May it be so.